Hola, estudiantes. Welcome. We are having a lecture today on queer theory. Now, chapter 1, pages 1 to 21, and then queer a graphic history, and that's going to be pages 3 through 17. I'm going to start with queer a graphic history. I feel like we'll move through that lecture a lot faster. It's a easier way of getting information about some of the terms and concepts that we are learning in the class today. So in the initial pages, I really like that the authors show you, not only telling you, but show you what the book is all about. So they summarize quotes from different queer theory scholars, and then they show you who the book is written for, what types of people. And on page 6, they give you the goals of our textbook, and there are 6 of them for introducing queer theory to you. And I'm not going to read it, but I do want to point out goal number 2 is really significant. Consider how wider Western culture came to understand sex and sexuality and the ways that it currently does, and how queer theory challenges this. And we'll get into a little bit more of that binary ideology here in Queer Theory Now when I swap us back to that textbook. So, similar to Queer Theory Now, this textbook also asks you to consider, what does this term queer mean? What is queer? And really, it's about reclaiming some agency, and it actually moves very much beyond identity politics, and they do talk about that in both of the textbooks. And I think the Queer Theory Now book gives you 3 specific ways you could use queer as a noun, as a description, and or maybe an adjective. And then the most significant is as a verb, as something that you are being and doing. And they give you that little bit here in this textbook as well. And they even take you further in the graphic history of queer studies. They talk about how queer meant strange initially, and they take us back to the 16th century English-speaking countries, and that's on page 8. And it's really important to understand that history because we still have people in our communities and in our academic circles that don't like the term, just like Chicana and Chicano was reclaimed for Chicana and Chicano studies and for Mexican American community members and individuals. Queer was also reclaimed, and it moved beyond just being strange or odd to a form of hate speech. And they give an example of that, of the very first one, in an 1894 letter, the very first example of someone using queer to be derogatory. And they equate it on page 9 along with general phrasing that we might hear where someone says, oh, that's so gay, and maybe unintentionally, not trying to be negative, but it really is negative, and it's really hate context. And so the reclaiming discussion takes place on page 10 of the graphic novel history. And with that, it's really important to recognize that reclaiming terms is a form of agency. And we're going to get into a little bit of this discussion with the Queer Theory Now lecture. And when I talk about semiotics and language and signs and signifiers and signifieds, and you might not know what any of that means, and we'll get into it more soon. But if a quote at the top of page 10, one activist strategy for dealing with racism, sexism, homophobia, and other forms of oppression has been for people to reclaim the very words that are used against them. And then it gives you some examples. And then I really feel like the start of this graphic history is about the contention around the term queer. And so there's no solid definition. It's almost undefinable. And there's a lot of controversy with people using queer theory or using the term queer as an identity descriptor. And so that discussion starts up on page 11. And some of that is tied to the history and the abuse. So if you were living during a time when queer was being used as a form of insult, your relationship with it will be different than a more contemporary or younger individual who has come into the conversation and queer having already been reclaimed, right? So I think one thing on page 13 that they really highlight is queering queer. And it's really about breaking down that binary of this or that, male or female, woman or man. Binaries are bad. Anytime you find yourself falling into, it's either good or evil, it's either, sweet or sour. Usually these kind of binaries, we tend to stray away from them, and especially in academics. And we'll discuss that more in the Queer Theory Now textbook about postmodernism and post-structuralism. So that summarizes the first 17 or so pages in this textbook. Now I'm going to jump us straight into Queer Theory Now. And this is perhaps the more difficult book to understand purely because it's using a lot of high language, academic jargon, and it's jumping into some of the terms and peoples that the graphic history will more slowly introduce you to. So when I mentioned the defining the indefinable, that's the very first topic that's addressed here in the Queer Theory Now book on page 1. And it's a deliberately ambiguous term, and I already mentioned that. And on page 3, they note the 3 ways of using queer. So it was as a noun, which I already mentioned, as an identity that resists traditional categories, and finally as a verb. And the queering as a verb is perhaps the most important use of the term as a form of resistance and challenging expectations or norms. And we already talked a little bit about this in our class. And so as you continue on in this textbook, there is a lot of summarizing in this first chapter about what you can expect in the future chapters. So for instance, on page 4, they talk about Kimberly Crenshaw and intersectionality, which will come up again in chapter 3. They give you a very nice genealogy of queer theory in terms of how it fits in the academic trajectory of theory in general. So on page 7 is this really fantastic image. I really like this image. It shows the combining of a whole bunch of other fields of thought and scholarship: lesbian of color theory and activism, lesbian feminism, post-structuralism, postmodernism, lesbian, gay, bisexual activism, gay and lesbian studies, trans activism and theory, and how all of these are coming together to create this broader discussion of queer theory. And so they do a little bit of discussion on that page, on page 7, about postmodernism, post-structuralism, and queer theory. And this is where we get to semiotics. And I'm going to try to do a little demonstration on my computer for you. But I do want to point out postmodernism is often considered the, quote, death of the self. So this idea of meaning is ambiguous and our identity or the way we see ourselves is actually out of our control and formed by all of these, signs that we don't necessarily control the meaning of. It's a lot about deconstructing language, and that there's power actually in this fragmented identity or lack of identity. And it's a contested period because postmodernism started to become really popular in academic circles right when some of our scholars of color were asserting themselves in academic spaces and being recognized for their own contributions. So it came at a time when scholars of color were claiming their identity. At the same time, now we have kind of a Western Eurocentric form of knowledge making saying, well, identity doesn't matter anymore. Agency doesn't matter anymore. So it's kind of an interesting contested period, but I see the two are not necessarily mutually exclusive. So again, that binary. If you find yourself falling into this is good and this is bad, we know that way of thinking is very limiting. So how can we get out of this norming process that we've made in which we have to fall into a binary? So this leads me to my demonstration. I'm going to pause the lecture video and pull up my computer monitor. Okay, so it looks like the program is a bit limiting, or maybe I haven't quite figured it out. So I'm going to do the semiotics lesson for pages 8 and 9 of this textbook in a separate video, which you'll have access to soon. So let's continue a little bit more discussion before we end this first lecture. So a key concept that comes up on page 9, the gender binary, the notion of sex and gender distinction, and that gender is understood in the categories of male versus female, and how can we get out of this heterosexual matrix. Butler is brought up a little bit, and we're going to read more from her later. As you continue in this chapter, they explain the use of their term LGBTIQ and the limits with that as well on page 10. In our class, I usually refer to it as LGBTQ+, the plus mentioning all the additional variations such as asexual, gay, genderqueer, questioning, that would all fall under the plus, and that's just the term I'm using in the class. And then as you go on, I think it's really important to understand the difference about normativity And so that is discussed in a key concept box on page 12 through 13. Because what does it mean to be anti-normal or anti-normativity, right? What are we talking about in terms of the power dynamics when you fall outside of this I just want to be normal mentality? And then, I think the chapter ends very well with a roadmap for the book, and that's on page 18 until the end of 21. So you have the summaries, and they do mention that their queer theory also has been influenced by the role of whiteness and the construction of these accounts. That's at the top of page 18. So I want you to realize that we will be getting into some discussions with queer scholars of color as well, and how that plays out in these different chapters. And I'm going to leave you with the final thought that is the final sentence of this entire chapter, which I really like, on page 20. Indeed, we ought to remain vigilant about what queer theory does and for whom, even as we might seek to reshape the boundaries of what queer theory is now and what it might become. So reach out with any questions about this textbook or this textbook, and I'm going to get you your semiotics lesson next. Thank you.